All right, so now we're going to look at blood vessels, both arteries and veins. This is still in week 2, considered lab 40. So to look at them first, arteries and veins have several things in common. There are 3 layers. You've got an outermost layer called an tunica. They're all called tunics, by the way, or tunicas. Tunica externa is the outermost layer. Tunica media is this middle layer, and then there's an internal layer called the tunica interna. Both arteries and veins have these 3 tunics. Now, in arteries, I'm going to use black this time. In arteries, the tunica media, which is this here, is much thicker than in veins, because if you have looked at your lecture, you'll find out that we talk about how much more pressure is found in the arterial system than the venous system. And this layer of smooth muscle is what helps guide the blood to where it needs to go. Now, just like where the arteries have a thicker tunica media, the veins are going to have a special structure that arteries don't have involved in the tunica interna, and they're called valves. And they allow for one-way movement of blood. And so the valves, even though the veins don't have much pressure, these valves allow for blood to be pushed in one direction. And again, we go over that a lot more in the lecture videos. This is a picture of an actual artery, a cross section, and you can see how thick this is, and you'll see it even better on the next picture because it compares it to a vein. So this, if I put A here and B here, you should be able to tell me which is an artery and which is a vein, simply because, one, the thickness of the tunica media. This should show you that this one that is marked A is for an artery and B is vein. But the other thing is the shape. Because it has a thicker tunica media, arteries will generally have a much more uniform shape, unlike this little blob that is the vein. Now, the other thing in the vein is this little area here. That is the valve that we were just talking about, the valves that are in the tunica media, or tunica interna. So sorry. Now this is the labeled picture of it so you can see. Now remember, just a good rule of thumb to remember that a lumen is the hollow opening of something inside the body. So this is the lumen of the vein, and this is the lumen of the artery. Now this is a copy of our list of words, or list of arteries and veins that you'll need to know. Now, one of the big things is, and I just want to show you a couple of things that hopefully will make it a little easier, is that probably 80% of these are the exact same. You've got a subclavian artery and a subclavian vein. You've got axillary artery and an axillary vein. You've got a brachial artery and a brachial vein. You've got radial and ulnar arteries. You've got radial and ulnar veins. And you can keep going. Common and external iliac, common and external iliac, and internal iliac as well. All 3 of those. Femoral artery, femoral vein, popliteal artery, popliteal vein. You'll see that the majority of them cross over. There is the very common naming pattern of these arteries and veins where they try to stick together. Another thing that you really should be able to tell, which will help you, is most of these are either named for a bone that's near them or a body region. For instance, sub means below, clavian means clavicle. So if you know where the clavicle is, just look below it and you'll see this artery and vein. Axillary is a region. Axillary is a region in the body that we today would call the armpit. So if you know that's the axillary region, if you find the artery and vein there, they're called axillary artery and vein. So a lot of these, again, really, are just taking, this should be very simple because it's taking what you already know or should know and putting it into practical use. And that could be a pun because on the practical, it'll be useful. Ha ha ha. Anyway, sorry, trying to keep things less boring. So let's look at some of these. So this is our two, these are the two pictures that we have in our book, and in your lab book. I highly recommend, I'm not taking them up, but I highly recommend going through and labeling these, doing your best. Again, sometimes on these big pictures like this, it's hard to see exactly where it's labeling, but that's fine. Just do your best. So the first thing we look at is in the arterial system. And the place we're going to start is going to be the heart. Now, what I want you to look at here, this is the outline of the heart. This is going to be in your textbook. I'm not sure about the lab, but if you can see this, this is kind of the midline here, and I'm going to kind of try to circle around this bone called the sternum, which is right here. And you'll see that the majority of the heart is going to be on the left side because, again, mirror image, we're facing this person. So most of it's on the left side. And there is this big artery called the aorta that comes out. And this is where we're going to start. On the aorta, there's going to be three branches that come off the aortic arch. And I want you to remember that the heart is farther to the left because this first branch that we're going to look at is simply an extension cord to get on the other side of the sternum. So when we look at this next picture, this kind of has it. If I put it, along midline, this right in here should be the midline of the sternum. So we're going to have three branches. I'm going to have one here, I'm going to have the second one here, and then the third one here. So on our models, it generally has those three branches that you can see. All heart models, you can generally see those three branches off the aortic arch. Now this first one is unique in the fact that it is only found in one spot. Pretty much every artery and vein is going to be paired. You're going to have a right and left, which you will have to name, or put in the name, right or left. But this one is unique in the fact that there's no other one. And so it is called the brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk is simply an extension trying to get from this, which is still considered on the left side of the sternum, over to the right side of the sternum so I can have it branch, and these two branches are going to be comparable to the branches that are the other two coming off of the aortic arch. So I've got the brachiocephalic trunk, which is the very first artery coming off of the aorta. So this one here. Number two, we're going to see, is going to go up into the neck, the cervical region, and then go into the cranial cavity. This is called the common carotid artery, and specifically it is the left common carotid artery. All right. Now, anytime you hear the word common in arteries, all right, so artery, I'm going to draw it this way, and blood's flowing this way. If I've got an artery that is going to have branches that come off of it, kind of like this, it's going to fork, and I have the same root name in these two branches, only become more specific, then the area before it is going to be called common. So the common carotid is going to go up the cervical spine, and it's going to branch, and I'm going to have one branch that's going to go internal, go deeper, and so it's called the internal carotid artery. And then I'm going to have one that stays external, and it is the external carotid artery, as you'll see. So anytime you hear common in the arterial system, that means downstream there's going to be a split. Now in the venous system, it means that if I see common, then upstream there was a split and they merged to form the common. All right, so again, no big deal, just trying to give you some ideas because that'll help when you're naming things. All right, so common is what is going to have either in the venous system, it's where two smaller veins join together, and the two smaller veins are going to have the same root name to it. Or in the arterial system, it is farther down, the artery is going to split, and the two splits will have the same root name. All right, so I've got the common carotid. So I've got, going back to it, this is the brachiocephalic trunk. This is the left common carotid artery. And then this third one, this last one, is going to come and it's going to run right underneath this bone, which is called the clavicle. And so this, because it runs underneath the clavicle, now this is on the left side, so this is the left subclavian artery. We do not name this one. This one goes up into the cervical region as well, and it actually goes along the vertebrae. It's going to be the vertebral artery. If you remember when you were learning how to tell whether vertebrae were cervical, thoracic, or lumbar, one of the ways to tell on cervical is that they will have holes in the transverse foramen. The only area in the body that has these transverse foramen, holes in the transverse processes, and that's where this vessel goes. But again, you do not have to know that. So on this one, there's three. So we've got the brachiocephalic trunk, we have the left common carotid, and then we have the left subclavian. So if we follow the subclavian, or actually, I'm sorry, so we look at the picture, this is the model, so this is the aorta and the aortic arch. This is the first one that comes off, so that is the brachiocephalic trunk. This middle one that comes off is the left common carotid, and this last one that comes off is the left subclavian. And it gives the names of them. So if we go back to the picture, and now we look at, we've kind of looked at the vessels in this area. We get a little closer, we can see again brachiocephalic trunk. Now the brachiocephalic trunk, once it gets on the other side of the sternum, it is going to divide, and this is the right version of these two. So the one that's going to stay underneath the clavicle, this is the right subclavian vein, and the one that branches and goes into the cervical region and then finally into the cranial cavity, this is called the right common carotid. Now, on these two here, the right common carotid, you can see where it's going to divide, and you're going to have one that goes deep, that is the internal carotid artery, and then you have one that stays superficial, and this is the external carotid artery. On this picture, again, this is the common carotid. This is where it's going to divide, and there will be this one that goes internal. It's hard to see on this. The one that goes internal is the internal carotid. The one that stays external is the external carotid. Now, just to point out, we had talked about in lecture where we have baroreceptors that are monitoring blood pressure, and we said the one that's monitoring blood pressure going into the cranial cavity is located, it's called the carotid sinus, and that is where that is. So just to give you a little heads up. Now, another part here is as these blood vessels come up, there's a very clinically significant area called the circle of Willis, this is where, if I'm looking, this is looking underneath, at the floor, at the bottom of the brain. And so this is going to be arteries and veins that are coming up, and they're going to get right here. Now, this is the pituitary gland. This is where your optic nerves cross over. All kinds of stuff happens here. But what the big thing that we're talking about here is this little area that is, for lack of a better way to describe it, this is a little roundabout, basically, of blood flow. And there's a lot of little bends and twists in this little area, a little nooks and crannies, so to speak. So if I have an embolus, so if I have a thrombus that is formed and broken free, so I've got an embolus, which is free-flowing blood clot, there is a real distinct chance that if it gets in this area, it will lodge in some of these little nooks and crannies and cause a blockage in blood flow, which will cause a stroke, which causes cell death, ischemia. So this is the circle of Willis. It's at the base of the skull, or base of the brain. So going back to this picture now, take this journey down into the arm. So I've got the right subclavian, it's going to go into this area, which is considered the armpit. And at that point, that is the axillary artery. So it's still the same vessel, it's just in a different area. Of course, I wouldn't call it the subclavian when it's no longer anywhere around the clavicle. So I name it for the area where it is. This is the axillary area, and I probably have that a little high, but the axillary area would be roughly in this area. But once it gets out of that area, now it is in the upper part of the arm, which is called the brachial region. So this is now called the brachial artery. And you can see it's still the same vessel. It is now just associated with the brachial area. And then once it gets down to the elbow, it's going to divide. Now here's where it's really important that you remember which bones are lateral and which bones are medial in the lower arm. So the radius is the lateral bone. If you say, there's all kinds of different ways. I heard someone say, if you give a thumbs up, it's like you're saying it's rad, which to me just hurts me to even say that. But if it helps people, that's great. I always remember that if I want to change the radio, I'm going to hit it basically with my pointer finger. So I know that the lateral side is the radius. The ulna is the medial side. And so when this divides, this group or this vessel is called the right radial artery. This one is called the right ulnar artery. Now the right radial artery or the radial artery is where you're going to have a very common pulse point. You take the pulse just on this side of the thumb, and that pulse point is called the radial pulse. It's the pulse of the radial artery. So again, as we go down, this is basically like some kind of street that's going through a town. Through the town, it might have a name like Kings Highway, which is Highway 17. But once it exits Kings Highway, or once it exits Myrtle Beach and Merle's, it turns into just Highway 17. And when it goes through other towns, it'll be named things like Main Street and whatever. So this is the same thoroughfare. It's going to divide here, but it's just named for the location where it is. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, subclavian, right axillary, right brachial, right radial, right ulnar. So we go back to the overview. Now let's look at how the aorta takes a turn and descends. So we have a couple of different areas of the aorta. So we have what's called the ascending aorta and the aortic arch. Those two are pretty straightforward. Then we have this long one here that in general is called the descending aorta, and there is two parts to the name of the descending aorta. This that I drew is supposedly representing the diaphragm. So since this is the thoracic cavity here and this is the abdominal pelvic cavity here, or basically abdominal cavity, this particular part of the descending aorta is called the thoracic aorta, and this particular part of the descending aorta is called the abdominal aorta. It's just ways of being more specific. So on the descending aorta, only in the abdominal cavity is there any branch that I want you to know. All right. So there are tons of them. I'm just only holding you accountable for one, and it is this. These are going to the kidneys. Now you should know that anything associated with the kidneys in general is going to be called renal. So these are called renal arteries. So I've got a right and left renal artery. Now as the aorta continues to drop down, it's going to divide, and I'm going to have this right and left. This is called the common iliac artery. So I've got a right and left common iliac artery. And I had told you earlier, anytime you see common, it's probably meaning it's going to divide, and we're going to have a more specific name to it. And we do have a division. We have a division right here, one that goes into the pelvic bowl deep. So this is called the internal iliac artery, and there's one a right and left here. The larger part that continues down to the leg is called the external iliac artery. So we've got the common here, and then it divides. The external continues down to the leg. The internal is going to go into the pelvis. Now, in this area, the external, like I said, is going to continue into the leg, and there is a dividing line right through here, basically where your leg joins your thorax. This is called the inguinal area there, or the inguinal line. There's a ligament here that's called the inguinal ligament. This is a dividing line. So I've got the external iliac artery here, but once it crosses that dividing line, it changes names. Now it's in the leg, which this part of the leg is called the femoral region, and so it is now called the femoral artery. If we look at the picture here, you can actually see the ligament. So this is the dividing line. On this side, it is called the femoral artery. On this side, it is called the external iliac artery. And just FYI, you can kind of see that internal iliac there. Now, this is not to the, a right and left leg. This is the anterior view, and this is the posterior view of the right leg. So the femoral, as it goes through here, you see it kind of going down. Now the femoral artery is going to tuck around behind, so you see it more clearly on the posterior, and it's going to go in between the two condyles of the femur. This area, the posterior part of the thing we call the knee, is called the popliteal area, right? So we have the patella on the anterior right here. On the posterior, it's called the popliteal area. So this artery is called the popliteal artery. Now, once it passes there, it's no need to calling it popliteal artery. It is going to run along the tibia, along the anterior portion of it. You see how it kind of, on this, it's kind of behind, and then it sticks its head up front and then runs along the anterior ridge of the tibia. And at that point, it is called the anterior tibial artery. And then finally, the last one is the dorsalis pedis, or the dorsal pedis. We talked about this in the lecture version of the blood pressure and pulse points. This is one of the most clinically significant pulse points because it's the farthest away from the heart. So you test the longest stretch of the cardiovascular system. Now that is the arteries. Now again, most of them are well named. If you just kind of get a little idea of why it's named that, I mean, it pretty much is self-explanatory. So we're going to move on. Now we're looking at the venous system. Now the venous system, this is such a weird thing. As I try to teach it, it used to be where I would teach distal, so I'd teach at the fingers and go back to the heart because this is the way the blood flows, and I found it confuses people. But even now, I start at the heart and work my way out against the flow of blood, it still has a little confusing effect. So just remember, I'm going to start at the heart, and as we work our way out, I am going against the flow of blood. Now, the venous system has a lot of overlap with the arterial system, like I say, about 80%, but there are a lot of differences, and they can get a little confusing. So we're going to start with the heart again. Looking at the heart, so I've got two main vessels that bring blood back to the heart, to the right atrium, and they're called vena cava. So I have a superior and an inferior vena cava. Now I'm starting with the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava is this part right here. Now the superior vena cava is made up of two branches that merge together. Now these two branches that are right here, these are called brachiocephalic veins. Now in the arterial system, we just had one called a brachiocephalic trunk. It just was going over to the right. It's not a paired vessel. On the venous system, we have paired vessels. So we have a right and left brachiocephalic vein. Now the brachiocephalic veins are made up of two vessels that are merging together. One of them is coming down from the cranial cavity, and it is referred to as the internal jugular vein. Now, this is one of the few areas where it doesn't have a match set. We have a carotid artery that goes up and a jugular vein that goes down. And then, so we've got, this would be the right internal jugular. The external jugular is much smaller, and we'll see that in another picture. Now, this other one that is the merge with the jugular is called the subclavian vein. So this is the right subclavian vein as it comes in, and then this is the right internal jugular where they join together. This, again, now is the right brachiocephalic vein. The right brachiocephalic vein joins the left brachiocephalic vein to form the superior vena cava. Now, as we look at this, we're on the right arm as this one comes through, and it's really kind of below the clavicle. I know the way it's drawn here, they're trying to make it look artistic, but again, so this is the right subclavian vein. Now, the right subclavian vein is going to come from veins that are going to run pretty much in the area of the armpit, which we said was axillary, so it's called the axillary vein here. Now, before we get farther along, this is where it gets a little confusing. Veins, because they do not have a lot of pressure, are more web-like. There's a lot of smaller ones that merge together until we get to the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity to make the larger ones. But they're spread out in the extremities, so they're very web-like. They're all over the place. So when we look here, there's going to be general areas that we're going to be naming. Now, in the brachial region, we had a brachial artery, which was pretty simple. But in the venous system, it's a little bit more complex. So when we look at it, we're going to divide it into three areas. We have one that is lateral, one that is deep and medial. It's going to run along the bone. And then one that's going to stay medial. Now, so I've got 1, 2, 3. Make it where you can see one a little better. Now, this one that is lateral, this is considered the top of the arm. And so it is called the cephalic. I should have even started that because I can't spell it. The cephalic. So the cephalic vein on this one now, this is the right cephalic vein, is going to be on top. We think of cephalic to mean head, but when we get to the real root of the name, it simply means top. And in general, the top is the head. So this is called the cephalic vein because it is on top. Now, going all the way to number 3 here, this one's called the basalic vein. Now, it has its root in the word basal, and we've said this several times. Basal means bottom, stratum basal, the bottommost layer. The white blood cell called the basophil. It's called basophil because it's the least common. It's on the bottom of the list. So this number 3 in the venous system is called the basalic vein because it's on the bottom. So I have a head, a top, and a bottom. Now the one that's in the middle gets to carry the name of the area. So it is called the brachial vein. So that's how these 3 are named: top, middle, bottom. Cephalic on the top, basilic on the bottom, brachial in the middle. Now when we pull back out, now we get into this whole, like a big thing of angel hair pasta right here. Right, so I've got a group of veins on the lateral side and a group of veins on the medial side, and they are called the radial, which is lateral, and the ulna, which is medial, as they go down through here. Now, one other one, and I'll tell you, it's a pretty hard one to label because, again, everybody's very different. I'm going to say that it is this vein right here. It's called the median cubital vein. The median cubital vein is famous because it is where we draw blood from. If you've ever had it where they put the little rubber band around the brachial region, the upper part of your arm, you squeeze your fist a couple times to get that vein to kind of pump out, that is the median cubital vein. That's what they are trying to get pronounced so they can draw blood from it. So that's the median cubital vein. So going back, we look at the heart again. We get into this part now that is on the descending part. Now, there's only one artery and vein that I want you to know here, even though there are arteries and veins that are listed. You had the hepatic artery and vein, but they're not really shown well on this picture, so I will make sure they're not asked on anything. The only thing I want you to know in the inferior vena cava, which is this entire thing, just like the descending aorta, is the veins that go to the kidneys. So they are called renal. So I've got a renal vein here, just like we looked at the renal arteries. Now, as the inferior vena cava comes down, it is going to be made by the junction of two veins coming together, and they are called the right and left. So this would be the left common iliac vein. Now, the common iliac vein, like I said, if I see something that's called common, if I look downstream, I'll see it's a junction of two other things that will have, in this instance, iliac as the root of it. I'm going to have an external iliac vein that's going to merge with an internal iliac vein to form the common iliac vein. Just like in the arterial system, only this time, again, the flow is in reverse. Now, just like the arterial system, there's that same line that goes through here, right? And so on this side, I have the external iliac vein. On this side, just right here at this side, I have what's called the femoral vein. So let's take a closer look. So again, here is that inguinal ligament. So this right here is the femoral vein. Again, this is anterior here, and this is posterior here, right? So the thing about this is that there is a junction, there's a special vein in the leg that is unique. It's the longest vessel in the body. It's the longest artery or vein in the body, and it is called the great saphenous vein. That is what this is. It's what I'm pointing to here. It goes all the way down here. So, I mean, it is a very long vein. That is the great saphenous vein. Now, the great saphenous vein is simply a merger, a side road. The femoral vein is still the main vein in the leg. And the femoral vein, as it goes down, it's going to curl around and it's going to run between the two condyles, just like the artery did. And at that point, it is called the popliteal vein. And just like the artery, just below or inferior or distal to the popliteal region, I've got this vein that runs along the anterior tibia, and it is called the anterior tibial vein. So those are the arteries and veins. Now, there are some of them, like I said, with the hepatic artery and vein that I didn't go over in here, almost impossible to see on the pictures. Those, I had said that the only thing I want you to know in that area is the renal artery and vein. So go over these. Hopefully they make sense. They are very well named, but it requires you to have remembered what you studied back in 210. So kind of remember where these are and refresh it. This is going to be a pretty big part of the practical, I would imagine, this naming arteries and veins. So I hope that went well. Take care. Have a good day.